You're listening to Quorum Radio.
Quorum Radio now is on with David Crow. He's the author of the mega bestseller, The Pale-Faced Lie, a true story. And David had a very interesting background. He spent his early years on the Navajo Indian Reservation in Arizona and New Mexico. Through grit, resilience, and a thirst for learning, he managed to escape his abusive childhood, graduate from college, and build a successful lobbying firm in Washington, D.C. Today, David is a sought-after speaker, giving talks to various businesses and trade organizations around the world. Throughout the years, he has mentored over 200 college interns, performed pro bono service for the charitable organization Save the Children, and participated in the Big Brothers Big Sister program. An advocate for women, he donates a percentage of his royalties from The Pale-Faced Lie to Barrett House, a homeless shelter for women in Albuquerque. David and his wife, Patty, live in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. Well, David, it's great to have you on. I mean, this is such an exciting story. I think it's a story with tons of insights for those who have been through what you went through in your childhood, or who know someone who has, or maybe has an employee who has been through it, and maybe has to be a little bit more insightful and sensitive, and can be thanks to you. So it's great to have you on Quorum Radio. And I looked at so many things about this book, and I saw a really, really great plug from Publishers Weekly, quote, empowering missive about the long shadow cast by an abusive parent. Goodness gracious, which of course brings me to your childhood. Tell us about your childhood. Kind of give us a kind of like a bird's eye emotional topography view of what you and your siblings went through.
So I was born about 9 months after my dad got out of St. Quentin Penitentiary for a crime that could have gotten him the death penalty. When he got out, he fled to the Navajo Indian Reservation for two reasons. One, you could lie about being a violent felon. This was in the 50s and 60s. The Navajo people had not gone through extensive college education. There really weren't enough qualified people for jobs, so anybody that showed up could basically get hired. If you could drive a truck, use a shovel, read and write, you got promoted if you didn't shoot somebody that day. So the second piece is he went to the reservation so his accomplice wouldn't find him. He wasn't afraid of his accomplice in what I would call a fight, because Dad thought he could beat up anybody, but he was afraid of being ambushed. So going to the reservation solved two problems. Could lie about being a violent felon, and his accomplice would never fire him. And my first memory is Dad and I are driving around on the reservation. We lived up around 7,200 feet on what's known as the Defiance Plateau. It was in a blizzard, and Dad used to drive his car, what I call the Green Bomber, and hit the brakes. We'd just spin endlessly around in the car, and he thought that was great fun. I did too, until I hit my head hard enough. But my very first memory is, we have to get rid of your mother. If you grow up with her, you'll be crazy just like she is. It was, trying to just get through every day. But my dad tried to turn me into crime partner, confidant, the guy he wanted to really carry on his work. And he drew me in, mostly because I was a kid and didn't have much choice. We did all kinds of stealing from the Navajos. I helped them fence tools, did a lot of things I'm not proud of at all. But he told me all about his criminal mind, life in San Quentin, people he'd killed. And, he was a very brilliant, very charismatic, but a very demanding and psychotic guy. And I tried to figure out how I could live with him without getting myself and my siblings killed. And simultaneously, we had a very mentally ill mother who could barely function. She was more of a child than any of her children. So it was really quite demanding. Just getting through a day sometimes could be a big challenge.
So, did your mother at any point show any nurturing to you, any affection, any kindness, or no?
My mother's a kind person, still alive at 90. I love my mom, but the best way to describe her is she's a 6-year-old with 84 years experience. She's very angry. Like a lot of people who are mentally ill, they know something's wrong, but they don't know what. They don't think it's their fault. They just don't understand the world. Mom is the neediest person I've ever met. and incredibly demanding, and just a very broken child in an adult body. Very, very sad. Love her. I love her dearly, but I don't know that I've ever heard her laugh, seen her smile. just had a very, very tough life, and an extremely difficult marriage to my father before he abandoned her and then tried to kill her.
Wow. So you were kind of a little hellraiser, weren't you?
I was an incredible hellraiser. I did everything I could to act out, and I terrorized every town we lived in. But Gallup, New Mexico, particularly in the 50s and 60s, you got a little mining town with 100,000 Indians coming in the weekends to shop, trade, barter. 61 bars, alcohol around the clock, 7 a.m. to 2 a.m., 7 days a week. People drunk and passed out on the streets. You could do just about anything. I tell people you could have shot somebody in the head in the police department. Unless somebody was looking at you, they wouldn't even have stopped you. Crazy.
Amazing. Wow. An amazing time. So, I mean, growing up like this, you were like on your own quite a bit. Your dad kind of like, you're like this kind of this little mascot. He was proud of you because you're such a little wild rascal. And, how did that make you feel?
Well, childhood's a city you never leave, and you only know your own childhood till you get old enough to look at other people's, right? It was probably my early 20s before I realized how incredibly strange my childhood was. But we were completely on our own. We could get away with anything as long as Dad didn't get embarrassed and have to pay for it or fix it. And I hated being at home so much, and I was just so mischievous and angry that from the time I woke up till the time I went to bed, I just went out and raised all the hell I could raise.
Right, and that was just something. Basically, you learned that from your dad, or when he was just angry because you were neglected by your mom, or what?
Well, I hate to admit this. My brain works a lot more like my dad's in the sense that there's sort of this mischievous, think outside the box, do whatever the heck you want. But as an adult, I'm really not like that. I'm a firm believer in family and rules and society and civility and all that. But I was just on fire, crazy, angry, upset all the time with what was going on in the house, particularly against my mom and how violent my dad was to my brother and my sisters. And it was just an act of total rebellion that I probably really did not understand at all.
Right. So then give me an idea, just a slice of life of David Crow when he was a little kid, before you started getting involved in criminality. But, give me an idea. What do you remember most about your day-to-day existence?
Well, what I remember most is when you were with Dad, you were totally captured by Dad. And he had a fuse that was the shortest fuse on earth. And he had a chip on his shoulder that's almost immeasurably big. And he was extremely angry at the world because he thought he'd been cheated, right? His parents were very mean to him. They were Dust Bowl Okies during the Depression. Just doesn't get much worse than that in terms of how any of the people had to live in that day and at that time. So if you caught Dad before the white blood vessel bulged out on his forehead and his eyes kind of bulged out, if he was angry, you could stop him. I could stop him. Probably the only one of the kids. But if he ever got angry, there was no end of that anger until he did anything he felt like doing. So part of my job was to read his emotions, try to stop him from killing somebody or getting us in big trouble, and then trying to stop him from turning the violence on the rest of the kid.
Did you get beaten up by your dad?
By the buckle end of the belt, hundreds and hundreds of times. He would beat up my brother and I so hard that we were black, blue, bleeding. I mean, my legs were bruised from 4 to 16. He hit us so hard, and it never had anything to do with what we did wrong. It had much more to do with how angry he was, and he just took it out on us. He was a very violent, very mean guy.
Right. So then, was there any ray of sunshine, emotionally speaking, or somebody who cared about you and your siblings? Tell us about that if there were.
Well, the ray of sunshine is my dad was absolutely one of the smartest people I've ever met, and he really was. And he was very curious about the world. So one small story I can tell you, one day it just kind of captures Dad and me. I'm about 12 years old. We're on the reservation. We've driven off to a big warehouse to steal expensive electric tools, which he fenced. He was the head of the security and safety for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and they didn't keep good inventory. So he made money stealing and selling tools, and I was his lookout. And he would share stories about prison, things that went wrong. So one day we're driving back at the end of a very long day of stealing. We'd just sold the stools to some men. And we pull up in front of the Navajo Inn, which was a bar that sold more liquor than any in the entire state of Arizona, just off the reservation, because you can't drink on a reservation. Anyway, this man was killed, decapitated, and he worked for Bureau of Indian Affairs, so Dad had to investigate. And he starts explaining to me that we stole the land from the Indians, then put them on a reservation, then told them they couldn't drink, then created a bar just off the reservation where they could drink till they fell over and died, and how hypocritical the rules were, and everybody steals from everybody kills, his whole rationalization. But about a half mile later, when we left the scene, he found a coyote trapped in the desert, and he took the trap off with his really powerful hands, gave the coyote jerky and water, and said it's very wrong for the Navajos to trap these animals. All they're doing is their job, which is to kill sheep. And then he stopped, and this is quintessential Dad. So where are we standing? And I said, well, we're standing in the desert known as Arizona. And he said, no, this was an ocean. This was a tropical zone. This had dinosaurs. This had volcanoes. And he took you through a geological history of the last 75 million years. Then he started discussing the English classics, all the great writers, and how you had to understand all of this. Read the Bible for history. And he turned to me and said, if you don't know all these things, you're no better off than that coyote. I want you to know everything there is to know about everything you can know. No one cares what you learn in school. That's just for dummies. You create your own education, and you can make a fortune out of life, and you'll make something of your life that you could never be any other way. So Dad had that.
Wow. So did he instill in you then a tremendous love of learning and reading and self-improvement and self-education, or what?
Yeah, he did. Now, I have a couple of learning disabilities, which I don't feel like they're disabilities because I do fine with them. Very dyslexic, very, very nearsighted. And I can't hear out of my left ear because of an ear infection. So I didn't learn in school very fast. It took me a long time because most of the things you learn in school are, you have 50 minutes. You have to be able to read the board quickly. You have to be able to do things other people can do at the same time frames they do them. But I read every night of my life with a flashlight under the bed. That and running were my two things. And even now, I read a couple of books a week. I read 6-7 hours a day. I always felt behind. I never felt smart enough. And Dad gave me that thirst, that absolutely drive to know as much as you could know.
Wow. So then I want to ask you a personal question. Maybe this might be,
Go ahead.
You might have to invoke the Fifth Amendment on this one, but it sounds like you didn't use a ghostwriter, or did you? Did you have a lot of editing to this best-selling book, or did your dad just instill in you so much love of reading that you developed your own style?
It's my own style. Dad basically told me I was stupid my whole life because I didn't do well on any of the testing. And I always felt stupid because when you're dyslexic, particularly there weren't many tools. So, half the kids are Indian and their families don't speak English. And, we had a lot of things working against us. And I was scared to death I was stupid. But I always had a tremendous memory, and I could remember everything I read. And I found that this dyslexia, as I call it, was my superpower. And the ability to read and remember everything gave me a power and strength that I've used throughout my life, including to this very day. And it stopped me from feeling stupid. It's just kind of crazy. I never learned what you're supposed to learn on time. But when I study a subject, I know everything about it, and I remember what I read. And if it wasn't for that, as he said, I would probably be pumping gas on the reservation.
Something you got from your dad. I mean, of course, a lot of trauma, but I mean, you develop that ability to go deep, to learn a lot, learn extensively. I guess have an appreciation for learning. So, tell me about some of the crimes you guys did. Your dad had you and your dad were fencing, stolen stuff. What else? What else would go on?
Well, we would steal very expensive tools and sell them. But Dad would tell me about murders committed, the inmates in San Quentin. So one of the parts about the book I think that's fascinating is the San Quentin stories. I had to cut some out in the book, but Dad would tell me about being in the yard, the big yard where, the prisoners have recreation. And in a maximum security prison, it's anything but recreation. You've got the lifer cons who are, somewhere around 40, they're never going to get out. And so they control everything, gangs, sex, drugs, you name it. And just what a vicious world the inside of a prison is, and how prisoners would confess to murders they committed that they were never caught for. I mean, after all, everybody in prison's innocent of the crime that they were convicted of. That's just hilarious, but it's true. They're all innocent. He was too. But he would tell me about murders. He would tell me about psychological situations where two guys who maybe wouldn't kill get together and then they would, kind of like in Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. There was a murder like that in San Quentin. But he would tell me these incredible stories about what he had lived through and what he did himself. And it was frightening and fascinating all at the same time.
You were taking all this in. At what point did you start to say, hey, something's wrong, something's off? There's got to be another way, another, perspective on life.
Well, I'm not proud to admit this. It didn't happen until high school. I had several angels. I think I call angels people who really loved me and looked after me. Two of them, the first two were Navajo. The third was my African-American high school track coach. And I watched them teach me about morality that was opposite of what Dad said. And I admired them and I loved them. And I saw the respect that people had for them. And I also realized that they were living their life the correct way and that we were living the wrong way. And that nothing Dad said was true. So it took a while, but I figured that out.
Right. So, you mentioned, and I heard one of your interview clips and you mentioned there's some pale-faced lies. There are some lies that you were dealt in your life. Now, maybe you don't want to reveal any of them, or maybe you wanted to give a one or two off. What were some of the lies?
You never want to give away the book, although it's been out 2.5 years, so I'm not that worried about it. But Dad created a web of lies that began with our heritage being Cherokee, which is not true. But the whole lie, everything about the big lie, who we were, what he was, what he had done, was all generated to create this image of himself that was the opposite of what he felt about himself. He did not want to be, his parents were from Texas and they migrated to Oklahoma. He did not want to be, and I'm going to use his words, Okie, Texas, white trash, depression, dust bowl people, which is what he felt his mother and father were. So he created this image of being a great Cherokee that had been picked on, abused, that had to overcome all these things. And it became his persona, his way of projecting pride when he really felt very, very deep shame.
Basically,
he's a very complicated guy.
Right. So then, so your mother and father, they were not Native Americans, right? At all, or somewhat.
If when I finally confronted him about the being an Indian, he tried to fight me, hit me. I was old enough, strong enough to stop him, but it was incredibly important to him to believe this. And even though my mom's about as pale as a ghost, she grew up in Quanah, Texas, and Quanah Parker, the great Comanche chief, was from there. So Dad said, well, she's a Comanche and I'm a Cherokee or full blood. And it just became so important to him. It became more important to him than anything else. And challenging him on that was not the thing to do unless you wanted to fight to the death.
And then how old were you, when this happened? How old were you when you confronted him about this?
I was pretty old. Dad and I stopped talking when I was an adult for a long, long time until he got very ill. He needed me to be his medical and legal guardian. And then I had forgiven him and I took care of him in the end. I confronted him before that happened, but I became mature enough finally to just let it all go, right? If he wanted to be a full-blood Cherokee, let him. If he wanted whatever he wanted to think he was, I let him believe it. I never let anybody else believe it, but right up until the time he died, he was telling people he was a Cherokee elder and he had a roll number and, he came from Warriors and Oklahoma and Texas. And, he had to know not a word of it was true. But again, he believed it to the point that you couldn't challenge him on it. And I think part of the pathological illness he had, and that you find with people who are very pathologically ill, they can convince themselves of anything.
Wow. So just curious, what is there something that you realized? Did you go back into ancestral records?
Yeah, I did.
Or just put two and two together? Or
so I'm old enough that before Ancestry, the best way to find out about genealogy was the Mormon Church, and it's still not a bad way. The Mormons have done an unbelievable job of cataloging. They're fantastic. Their libraries are among the best. But as we know now, Ancestry has superseded that. And my wife is an incredible researcher and what I call an ancestry freak. She could find anything. She should have worked for the FBI instead of being a teacher, but she doesn't agree with me. But we're able to very clearly trace they were a farming family. My grandfather was the 7th of 12th on a farm in Texas, just across the Red River from Oklahoma. They migrated from England, Northern and Ireland, early 1700s, were here before America became a country, and migrated from, I think, Maryland, North Carolina, across, and then Texas. So I know for a fact, even and when you do the swab test on Ancestry, I actually test more Middle Eastern and African than I do Indian, but it's like 0.00000%, right?
That's funny. Yeah.
I mean, we're all really related at some point. I mean, I don't want to get into any theological, but yeah, I'm more Middle Eastern and African than I am Indian. So if that gives you any idea.
Wow, amazing. All right, so so you realize this late in life. You were like married and settled down, and you realize I'm not a Cherokee, or I'm not a Navajo, or I'm not Creek, or anything like that. What was the impact for you? What did that do to you? Did you feel liberated, or robbed, or what?
Well, William, you've hit at one of the core issues of the book, and I'm very happy you did that because I want our listeners to hear this. The reason I wrote the book, it really was not to make money, not to get rich, because believe me, anybody who wants to write a book and they're first-time author and you're not known, you have a much better chance of buying lottery tickets or running for president. Your odds of making it are very, very slim. So I didn't do it for that. But what I did was I grew up ashamed of who I was, guilty, ashamed, the things we did to my mom, the things I did, criminal things, and just things that I was so ashamed of my family that I never came clean, right? I could never come clean about who I was, what I'd been through, what my family had done. And so when I took me into my early 50s before I really, really came to grips and could be honest with people about all of this. And when I did, I felt a cathartic feeling before I wrote the book, but the book was about not only explaining myself to myself, but it was about telling people you can overcome things you don't think you can overcome, and you can become somebody way different than who you were taught to be. I think by the age of 10, I was so broken and my spirit was so shattered. And I had such a feeling of not liking myself, hating my family story, that I almost never escaped it. And I think many people go through this. They are told things about themselves when they're young. I get thousands of emails, letters, and it's about people my own age who said, I always thought I was fat, stupid, ugly, dumb. I never could trust adults. I never got married. I was never able to be intimate because I was never able to be vulnerable. All that got crushed when I was a child. And my book is you can undo it. It's not going to be easy. You're going to have to work real hard, but you can be something very different than what you were raised to be.
That's amazing. So you mentioned somebody who apparently have a big impact on you. He was a mentor, and wasn't he a Navajo? What is he? Tell us about that guy.
Well,
maybe there are a few.
I had 7 mentors, but my first 2, one was an 80-year-old Navajo woman named Evelyn. Her grandmother was 4 and walked back from the long walk, the Navajo Holocaust. She taught me about kindness. She taught me about forgiveness. My second mentor was a Navajo code talker, and his son is still one of my very closest friends. He had 9 children. He taught me about tough love. And if you don't do things the right way, you're not going to be allowed to come in my house. He was my 4-H teacher. He was my baseball coach. He's the father of my best friend. And he was very strict, but he wasn't mean about it. My dad would beat you for anything. He wouldn't do anything like that. He'd just say, you did the wrong thing. You have time out. You can't come over. So he taught me that. My third mentor, we eventually moved to Bethesda, Maryland. We moved back and forth to the reservation, but we kind of stayed in Bethesda. And my African-American coach was the only Black teacher in an all-white school. And the day Martin Luther King was assassinated, we happened to be in the District of Columbia running against an all-Black team, and we were an all-white team. And I never faced this kind of situation before because I raised on a reservation. And there was an incident of stealing some shoes and pushing and shoving and a lot of mean talk. And he got us on the bus and he told me, you will rise above this. You will never take the bait. You will be gentlemen. You will be disciplined. You will be kind. You'll have integrity. Get off the bus and shake hands and apologize with every athlete. Well, we didn't think we should. They were just as wrong as we were. And he said, fine, then you're going to walk home. So we got off and shook hands with everybody. He got us back to school. He said, you are going to be certain kind of men or you're not going to be my athletes. If you're not better than taking a taunt, taking a threat, or taking an insult, then you're not really who you think you are. And you will be disciplined, you'll be respectful, you'll do what you're told, and you will do it with kindness, or you won't do it with me. And I don't know that anybody other than Chauncey Ford's his name, and he's still alive and well, and I love him to death, taught me more about what a man or a woman, but a man and my should be, and how you should conduct yourself. Exactly the opposite of what my dad said. On that very night, he was helping people loot in Washington, D.C., and stole radios and expensive stereo that he carried home. So I'm seeing this extreme opposite.
Your father was there too?
My father, we were in Washington, D.C. He was at the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is 2 blocks from the White House. He stayed with the looters, stole a very expensive stereo and a bunch of radios, and came home at 1 o'clock in the morning. Yeah.
Wow. So you had these 2 role models. Your dad was there in D.C. during the riots, stealing, and then you had your Black track coach or basketball coach, was it?
He was a track coach and economics teacher. But he, I did. You have to make a decision at some point in your life. Who do you want to be, right? I get letters from prisoners like, I was raised like you, and I'm still in prison, and I can't overcome what happened to me. And I always write them back and say, you must not have gotten anything out of my book. You can overcome anything. Start making some good choices. When you get out, support the mother of your children. Turn those kids from hating you into really loving and respecting you. This is on you. You can't blame society or anybody else. This is your decision. But Chauncey Ford taught me that. And then I had other mentors after that. But the first three got me through, up to 17 years of age. And all three of them were incredible human beings, two Navajos and an African-American man. And I learned more from them than I have ever learned from anybody before or since.
Wow. So let me ask you a question. So was this crucial towards your transformation to a guy who, came from a really tough background and then ended up going to college? Was that fundamental for you to rise above it all then?
Yeah, it was very fundamental for me. I always felt like the stupidest kid in any school I was in. We missed a lot of school. I basically failed out of high school, but my coach pushed me through. We're just so far behind, and my dyslexia, I needed to learn to compensate for it, and I needed to get kind of glasses that helped me read better. And so I was driven like you can't imagine to overcome all of this. I would never stop. I would read at night until the flashlight fell out of my hand and wake up the next morning with it there. And I never stopped doing that.
And so at some point, you're accepted into college. Dave, tell us about that.
Well, I didn't know what I wanted to be. When I got into the government relations, political business, a lot of that is understanding issues, understanding, really kind of the history, where your clients are coming from, what Congress is doing, what the president is like. And the more I read about all that, the more I understood it. And at some point, I just realized I had a great education. I just had to put it together myself. But it all worked.
So then, okay. And then you went to college. And at what point did you become a lobbyist? Was that like a little bit later in your career, or
pretty early, actually?
Almost from the get-go, or you worked
I went to work for another of my angels, Congressman Tom Coleman, who's still a great friend and took a chance on me. And then two other angels, Randy Russell. I got to work in the Reagan administration and the Department of Agriculture and Congressional Affairs, which is a very, very good job, for a young guy. And then I went into lobbying right after that, and then started my own firm almost 40 years ago. I have four great partners, all a lot smarter and better than me, but they're stuck with me because I started it. And able to make a career out of it. I've mentored somewhere between 200 and 250 college interns. I've got 3 right now, 4, I guess, and tried to, play it forward and give people the chances that I always wished I had.
Well, amazing. So, it's one of the things I notice about you is this gratitude, this graciousness with people. It's a wonderful thing to see. I've dealt with lots of people on my own. I've dealt with F. Lee Bailey for a while. It was kind of like his acting publicist, and some famous people here and there. And the thing you remember is the humility, the kindness, the graciousness that comes through with some, but not all. And so, do you consider that like one of the fundamental things to your success, being able to be a people person? I mean, what qualities? 1 second, let me ask you a question. What qualities do you have to be a successful lobbyist?
Probably a head of concrete. No. I think it's like it's no different than a lot of other professions. It has a mystical quality because of national news, and we use a lot of terms that only we understand, and if we didn't do that, you could see right behind the curtain. I just think it takes good intelligence, good perception, the ability to see an issue from all sides before you decide how to pursue your issue. And the thing that I believe in deeply, other than humility, respect, gratitude, and being very, very appreciative of great good fortune and angels who in my life, is when you approach somebody of an opposite position, and you may be so antithetical that you could hardly be in the same room. Respect their point of view, understand their point of view before you try to talk about yours, always be unfailingly honest with them, even if it doesn't make you look good. It's 100% about building trust and building relationships. If people trust you, then you've got something that's so fundamentally powerful that it can transcend anything. And if you're humble and you actually care about them as a person and you really mean it, and you get to know them before you start, pushing what you're trying to do, you can build on that. And I believe in that more than anything else. Relationships and trust, and do your homework. Make sure you always understand completely where the other side is coming from.
I want to bring things up to 2020, 2021, the pandemic, all this violence. And, one of the things that came through, the George Floyd riots, but one little nugget that I got was that your dad, here he is, claiming to be a full-blooded Cherokee, or that you are, and that he was like justifying theft because of all the theft that took place that was perpetrated against the indigenous peoples, the Indians. And so he was justifying that I could steal because this is what all the bad things they've done to our people, right? Turns out he wasn't one of them. So what's your reaction to this idea of reparations? You and I aren't slaves. I only know one slave, he's a former slave. He lives in Henrico, Virginia. He was from the Sudan. He was a slave when he was a boy. He was kidnapped with about 700 other kids from his city, and they were carried off by Mujahideen into North Sudan. And he was a slave. But he's an exception. Nobody else in the United States, for the most part, aside from his people, are slaves. And you and I aren't slave masters. And so, but we have this talk now about reparations. It gives me the impression of basically taking from people who never took from them nor from their ancestors. What's your reaction to that? This is politically sensitive, explosive, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
And here's the thing. I spoke to the Indian tribes of the U.S., and the reason they picked me is my description of the reservation and how sad and impoverished things were. So here's what I'd say about reparations in Indians. One, if you're not of a race, don't speak for the race. If you're not an African American, you don't understand the African American experience. If you're not a Native American, so thing one is listen. Thing two is make right as many things as you can make right now, right? Whether it's education, in the Navajos case, they don't have enough running water. There's not electricity. There's not all kinds of things. I just got back last week from another trip, and it's that people don't really understand what's going on with them and how difficult their lives are. And there's a lot of things we can do. I'm not necessarily an advocate of reparations, but I'm a big advocate of understanding where other people come from, helping them, and to make sure you understand that their experience probably does not have them as well equipped to compete in the 21st century as your and my experience, and that we need to do a whole lot more to help indigenous people, African American people, and people who live on the margins, no matter what their race.
Right. Well, listen, I want to be respectful of your time. I want to thank you for talking about Paleface Lies, and it's a book, folks. It's they're on Amazon waiting to be bought. It's a fantastic book, and so it's something that the Paleface Lie, a true story, is something that I think will be insightful. Grateful to have you on Forum Radio.